What is good, YouTube? Welcome back to another installment of K5 Reacts. You already know we got a banger. The disturbing history of lobotomies. Go ahead and tap the fucking.
Have you or a loved one experienced any of the following symptoms? Moodiness, irritability, depression, anxiety, homosexual urges? Well, it might be time to consider a lobotomy. A lobotomy is a simple procedure where part of the brain is cut off and all your troubles along with it. Lobotomies have changed the lives of thousands of patients.
I want to know their thought process when performing lobotomies. How did they expect that to help your brain? By sticking a needle up your nostril or through the eye into your brain. How is that going to help? How is cutting out a piece of your brain going to help? That's what I want to
Perhaps
know.
for the better.
I want to know their
Don't take
thought
it from me.
process.
Take it from one of our many satisfied customers. Side effects may include irritability, depression, anxiety, loss of emotions, fatigue, anger, incontinence, irrational hatred of cartoon turtles, mental retardation, coma, ego death, twink death, and regular death. First, the patient was rendered unconscious using electroshock therapy. An ice pick was then placed underneath the patient's eyelid and pointed upwards towards the brain.
Electroshock therapy. So they got put unconscious with electroshock therapy, and then they got a needle stuck up their brain. We got to be living in one of the best generations for healthcare. Because imagine living in the 1800s. You know, you got a little headache, your head hurting. You go to the doctor and they suggest a lobotomy, and they shock you until you unconscious, and then they stick a needle in your head through your nostril.
Using a hammer, the doctor tapped the back of the ice pick, breaking the thin bone just above the eye. The ice pick was inserted 3 inches into the patient's frontal lobe and moved side to side, severing the neural connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. The process was then repeated on the other side. What I just described here is a transorbital lobotomy, a surgical procedure popularized by a sociopathic doctor named Walter Freeman. Believe it or not, back in the day, lobotomies were all the rage. From 1936 to 1960, 50,000 of them were done in the US.
Okay, so they did 50,000 of them. And did they get any like good conclusive research back to be doing this many lobotomies? Because if they doing 50,000 over the US and people are getting lobotomized and it's not turning out well, why were they still continuing it?
At one point, it was considered a miracle cure for things like schizophrenia, depression, OCD, even gay. That is until the disturbing truth came out.
Yo. Imagine having depression in the 1800s and you go tell your doctor, like, you can't describe what depression is to him. You just like, I'm always sad. I just can't explain it. And they be like, I got something for you. Lay down on this table. We finna go ahead and get this taser. We finna shock you till you unconscious and stick this needle in your nose, and it's gonna fix the problem. And the patient was okay with that and agreed.
Was often worse than the disease. Thousands of people's lives were ruined while others were ended. Which raises 2 questions. 1, what the and 2, why the Well, don't worry guys, I'm gonna answer both these questions. Probably. So let's start at the beginning. The Second International Congress of Neurology was basically like Burning Man for nerds. Every prominent neuroscientist in the world was there, including the 2 men that would go on to create the lobotomy.
So you tell me you got every prominent scientist across the US, and this the best solution they can come up with is sticking a nail up your nose.
We'll get into them in a second.
How did they conclude?
As you can imagine, most of the presentations were boring as hell. Except for one, that is. A researcher named John F. Fulton brought out a pair of chimps named Becky and Lucy. He explained that the chimps were trained to complete a series of tasks in exchange for treats. Fulton noticed that the chimps would sometimes get extremely frustrated when they failed their tasks. That's when he thought to himself, hey, I wonder what would happen if we just cut a part of their brain out. And that's exactly what he did. And what he found was incredible. The chimps only had a slightly harder time completing their tasks, but even though they were messing up more, now they took their mistakes in stride, and they didn't crash out.
Okay, so they cut out a piece of their brain, basically dumbing them down, because if it's harder for them to perform tasks, they just dumbed them down. But it made them less aggressive. Of course, it's gonna make them less aggressive if they cut out a piece of their brain, because it just dumbed them down.
Fulton remarked that it was as if they joined a happiness cult. These findings had a major impact on two people in the crowd in particular: Walter Freeman, who I mentioned earlier, and a Portuguese neurosurgeon named Igaz Moniz. Moniz thought to himself, if it work on monkey, why not work on human? Moniz wasted no time. He grabbed a couple of patients from the local insane asylum and immediately...
And that's a wild phrase. If it works on a monkey, let's do it on a human. And they just went along with it.
Started experimenting with a new procedure he called the lobotomy.
Now, if this sounds absolutely insane to you, I have something even more insane to share. Data brokers are out there selling your personal information. That's why the sponsor of today's video is Aura. You know how you're always getting calls from Scam Likely? Well, that's because data brokers on the internet take your info and sell it to the highest bidder, usually without consent. Now, data brokers are required to remove your data if asked, but who has time to message all of those schmucks? Well, that's where Aura comes in. Aura does all the hard work for you by scanning the internet and automatically removing your info from these disgusting data broker sites. When I saw how many sick freaks had access to my info, I almost had to lobotomize myself. But I guess it's my own fault for clicking all those hot MILFs in your area ads. Oh, and Aura has other features like bank fraud alerts, an antivirus, and a VPN. So I recommend you try out Aura. Right now, you can get a 14-day free trial if you use my code aura.com/Dantavius. That's aura.com/Dantavius. Also, it's linked in the description. Thank you, Aura. Now, where was I? That's right.
The lobotomy. It involved drilling dime-sized holes in the skull and scooping out pieces of the brain with this...
So that's even worse than lobotomy. So you tell me they cracking your skull open like a watermelon, and they got the scooping. And I know they ain't have the right tools back then. I wonder if they got like an ice cream. Imagine this scenario. You know, you've been having head pains. You go to the doctor. They crack your skull open and just start with an ice cream scooper scooping out pieces of your brain.
Called a leucotome. Moniz believed that taking out these pieces of the brain would sever the neural pathways, which would basically factory reset the brain and fix a lot of mental problems like schizophrenia and psychosis. Now, the reason Moniz was in such a hurry to develop this new procedure was because he was desperate for a Nobel Prize. He had been nominated twice, but was snubbed both times. Now, he was at the tail end of his career and felt that the lobotomy was his last chance at that sweet, sweet Nobel gold. In the following 4 months, Moniz performed 20 more lobotomies and reported that 35% of his patients were cured of their disorder. Another 35% showed...
You know how low 35% is out of 100? And that's not even over a long time. That's not even over a long period of them watching their behaviors. Because he was trying to do it fast to get that Nobel Prize. So you know he probably watched them for about a week. He just dumbed them down.
Some improvement, and the final 30% showed no change. But the accuracy of this data was up for debate, and a lot of Moniz's contemporaries weren't sold. In fact, they thought he was more insane than the people he was operating on. But that was the minority. In fact, Moniz did end up winning the Nobel Prize for his work, and his research influenced a lot of people, including Walter Freeman, who is basically the main character of our story. Freeman was responsible for kicking off what I like to call lobotomania. Because of him, tens of thousands of people would get their brains turned into scrambled eggs. We'll get to him in a second. First, I think we need to answer a question that I'm sure you've been asking yourself. Why were people so ready to embrace this barbaric frankenfuck of a surgery? Well, to put it simply, it's because oftentimes it was better than the alternative. You see, sanitariums...
I mean, yeah, for the time, I understand why people went along with the surgery. Because if you got like doctors from all over the country coming together, it's a better alternative than what they probably had. If that was the best alternative, then I don't want to hear the worst.
hospitals, insane asylums, whatever you want to call them. Back in the day, they were hell on earth. They were crowded, filthy, dangerous, and understaffed. Here's a quote from a 1946 Life magazine article to put things into perspective. "We feed thousands a starvation diet. We jam-pack men, women, and sometimes even children into wards so crowded that the floors cannot be seen between rickety cots, while thousands more sleep on bare floors. Hundreds spend 24 hours a day in stark and filthy nakedness. Those who are well enough to work slave away in many institutions for 12 hours a day."
Yeah, see, I'm so glad that I'm in the 20th century with 20th century healthcare, because I could not live through this. Getting packed, if you get sick, you getting packed up like a can of sardines with a whole bunch of other sick people catching a disease. And if you well enough, they're going to slave you for 12 hours. You know, slight 12 hours.
Often without a day's rest for years on end. Worst of all, for these wards of society, we provide physicians, nurses, and attendants in numbers far below the minimum standards set by state rules. Restraints, seclusion, and constant drugging of patients become essential in wards where one attendant must herd as many as 400 mentally deranged charges. At the time, there was no medication and treatment options were limited, so doctors tried all sorts of insane methods like malaria therapy, insulin-induced comas, and of course, electroshock therapy. Walter Freeman had spent his entire...
So basically, their healthcare was shit, so they just started trying everything. They started just doing guinea pig experiments. They was like, they already sick, we might as well use them as guinea. See what works and what doesn't.
We are working in one of these mental hospitals. What he saw there traumatized him, and he made it his life's mission to combat mental illness by any means necessary. Now, this mission wasn't completely altruistic. Freeman, like Moniz, was obsessed with his legacy. He said himself that the whole reason he even took a job at that mental hospital was for fame and fortune. You see, Walter Freeman's grandfather was like the most famous doctor in America, and Freeman wanted to fill his shoes. He wanted to be known as the man who solved mental illness, and he thought that the lobotomy was his ticket to achieving that goal. So on September 14th, 1936, Walter, along with neurosurgeon James Watts, performed the first lobotomy in the United States. Their first victim, patient, was...
Okay, their process was to cut out nerves in the brain, but if they're brain surgeons, they should know everybody's brain composition is different. Like, everybody's brain is not the same.
Alice Hammett. Alice suffered from severe depression, anxiety, insomnia, and mood swings. Her condition had gotten so bad that her husband had her committed to a mental institution out of fear that she would take her own life. But Freeman offered her an alternative. Here's a detailed description of Alice's operation. Now keep in mind, this is different from the one I described in the intro. That version of the lobotomy won't come for several more years. They made incisions 3 centimeters in length into the scalp. Using a drill, they made holes in the skull in the left and right frontal lobes. They then inserted a leucotome straight down through the hole into the exposed surface of the brain. The tissue had the consistency of warm butter. Pressing a stylet at the top of the instrument caused a wire loop to protrude from the other end. They rotated the loop full circle and cut a round core of white neural fiber. Next, they pulled out the instrument a single centimeter and cut another core, followed by...
Alright, so they was just basically putting it down in their head, corkscrewing it, and then pulling out a piece.
The surgery continued until a total of 12 cores had been made. The operation had lasted about an hour. Oh, by the way, this was Walter's first time ever doing surgery. Can you imagine that? I couldn't even let a barber cut my hair if it was his first time. Despite that though, everything seemed to be okay. At first. I mean, she was alive, but after a few days, Alice started having some cognitive problems. She had trouble understanding people and could barely speak coherently. Walter hung his head in shame. His first lobotomy was a massive failure. Or so he thought.
No, he butchered it. He definitely butchered it. It's his first surgery. He didn't cut this lady head open and just started scooping out pieces of her brain. That was going to be a butchered job to begin with. Especially for the tools and instruments that they had at the time.
Few weeks, Alice would slowly start regaining her cognitive ability. Even better, her anxiety had almost completely disappeared. And for the first time in years, she was able to get a full night's rest. Absolute cinema. Tremendous comeback. By 1942, Freeman and Watts had performed almost 100 lobotomies together.
So
They
you tell me it
published their
actually
findings
works
in a book
some way?
titled Psychosurgery, which is a bit of a double entendre. In it, they claimed that 63% of their patients saw improvement after getting lobotomized. Now, this data was very, let's just say, trust me bro-ish, but we'll get into that later. Freeman also took before...
Those numbers are not adding up. They're not adding up at all. Ain't no way 63% of people that got lobotomies say it helped them in the long run. Yeah, that's gotta be made up data.
After photos of all his patients. Check this guy out. Before, he was perplexed, unable to solve the simplest problem. But after his lobotomy, he became a cool cigar smoking badass. He didn't even need glasses anymore. You know, if I saw this, I'd probably get a lobotomy. Freeman's data, along with Moni's winning the Nobel Prize, lended a ton of credibility to lobotomies, kicking off lobotomania. In the 40s and 50s, almost 100,000 lobotomies would be done around the world. Even the New York Times was raving about what they called the surgery of the soul. A new surgical technique cuts away sick parts of the human personality and transforms wild animals into gentle creatures in the course of a few hours. It is asserted that mental symptoms relieved by this new brain operation include tension, apprehension, anxiety, depression, insomnia, suicidal ideas,
delusions, hallucinations, crying spells, melancholy, obsessions, panic states, disorientation, nervous indigestion,
and hysterical paralysis. Okay, I'm pretty sure some of that stuff is made up. With the medical industry and the media on their side, Freeman and Watts went on to perform hundreds of lobotomies together. At first, everything seemed to be working out, but as you can imagine, there was a dark side to all of this. As the procedure grew in popularity, it became increasingly obvious that it wasn't the miracle cure touted by Freeman and Watts. I mentioned earlier that 63% of Freeman's patients saw improvement, but keep in mind this stat came from a book written by Freeman and Watts themselves. And improved by what metrics? Seems pretty subjective to me. Oh, and also close to 15% of people didn't survive. So some people did improve.
Up to 15%. They just up to 15%,
but others got worse.
That number gotta be definitely higher.
Some even died. It was a complete crapshoot what would happen, which probably explains why so many gambling addicts got lobotomized. More often than not, the procedure would completely rob people of their personalities and turn them into husks of their former selves. Look at this. This is one of Freeman's before and after pictures. He writes, in some instances,
he basically just turned them into a zombie. He started just taking out pieces of their brain, turn them into a husk of a human. He eliminated all their cognitive skills, basically severed all the nerves inside their brain, and said he fixed them.
That can be done for the family is to return the patient to them in an innocuous state, a veritable household pet. Schizophrenia patients make nice household pets after operation. Top 10 most psychotic things I've ever heard. Right up there with
pets is
Franklin the Turtle isn't that bad. Watts and Freeman wrote in one of their books that prefrontal lobotomy smashes the fantasy life and ruins creativity in doing so. One is justified in speaking of the lobotomized individual as a good, solid cake, but no icing. So for those reasons, lobotomies were supposed to be a last resort for people who had no other options. And they were for the most part, but a lot of the time they were just done on women with attitude problems.
It's got to be done on like people that can't afford all other alternatives at the time. So they just went and tried out this new surgery and got pieces of their brain cut out. It's like they went for desperate, down bad people that would do anything to like fix their mental health.
Hey fellas, have your wives been acting strange lately? Maybe they've been talking back, complaining too much, or not having dinner ready on time. A smack on the mouth can only work so many times. So it might be time to get them fixed up with a good old-fashioned lobotomy. The new operation that's sweeping the nation. Thousands of women have gotten lobotomies, and they can't stop talking about it. Well, at least the ones who can still talk. So fellas, talk to your doctor and see if your wife or daughter is a candidate for lobotomy. And don't worry if they feel uncomfortable. What are they gonna do? Say no?
Over 60% of lobotomies were...
Scenario, you go ask this girl and she say no. And then you go get her lobotomized. That's actually crazy work.
on women, and that percentage is much higher in other countries. These women, they didn't really have a say in the matter. If you were a lady in the 50s and your husband or father wanted you de-brained, it was gonna happen. The most infamous case occurred in 1941 when a prominent businessman and politician personally reached out to Freeman about his daughter. She had been acting up, embarrassing the family, and the father couldn't let that stand. Walt jumped at the chance. This guy was—
Oh, that's crazy. Imagine like she doing normal teen things, you know, being rebellious. You know how teens act, and he go get her lobotomized. No.
big shot. And if everything went well, it would give him a whole new level of prestige. But it didn't go well. Like, at all. The procedure had completely destroyed the woman's mental capacity. She regressed back to having the mind of a 2-year-old and spent the next 60 years in a mental institution.
He just took out all her cognitive
around the
skills.
clock. The woman was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of JFK. Man, what is it with this family and having their brains destroyed? Oh, and women weren't the only victims.
Do you struggle with the uncontrollable urge to have gay sex? Well, lucky for you,
Getting their
there's a
brains
fix for
destroyed.
that now. With a simple ice pick to the
why.
brain, all of your homosexual thoughts will go away, along with most of your other thoughts. Well, you better hurry up and get a lobotomy today, because they won't be around much longer.
Of male lobotomy patients, 40% were gay guys. Most of them were in prison for sodomy and were basically offered the choice of getting a lobotomy or staying in prison, and a lot of them opted for the scalpel. Despite all of that, lobotomania continued throughout the 40s and 50s. I already mentioned the appalling conditions in America's mental institutions. After World War II, that situation got way worse. In 1946, there were 500,000 people living in these hellholes. The American Psychiatric Association estimated that state institutions were 50% over capacity on average. The problem started spilling over into regular state hospitals where half the beds were taken up by psychiatric patients. And at the end of the day, institutionalized patients became a lot more manageable after they got lobotomized. Sure, a lot of them turned into—
I mean, of course they're gonna become more manageable because they're just zombies. They just took away their brain.
borderline zombies, but that was a risk many healthcare workers were willing to take. This wasn't really about making the patients' lives better, but making them easier to handle. So Walter Freeman wasn't worried about if lobotomies were ethical or not. He was worried that he couldn't do enough of them. You see, on top of his obsession with legacy, Freeman also believed that these mental patients were a drag on the economy. He once said, "I looked around me at the hundreds of patients and thought, what a waste of manpower." Freeman wanted to solve this issue as quickly as possible, which meant having to do more lobotomies. Unfortunately for him, though, the standard lobotomy at the time was—
How's he gonna say that's a waste of manpower when he basically just reverted them back into the form of a child, like the same mental capacity as a child? That don't even make no sense. His statement that he made didn't make no sense.
It took over an hour and required a whole ass medical team. That's when Freeman
If he
came up
actually
with his
fixed-
most
like,
genius
actually helped them
and most
and fixed them.
psychotic invention yet. A way for him to lobotomize a
If
patient.
he actually helped them with their mental illness instead of cutting out pieces of their brain, that would help more with manpower, because that would get more people mentally stable enough to help go out and work.
In a fraction of the time. And the best part, he could do it by himself. He called it the transorbital lobotomy, aka the ice pick lobotomy. This is the thing that would go on to ruin Walter Freeman's reputation forever. I described the process at the beginning of this video, but to refresh your memory, the doctor took his ice pick-like device and hammered it into the thin part of the bone at the top of the eye socket. Once it was good and deep in
so
the
it
brain,
did go through the eye.
doctor would move it side to
thought
side
it went through the
until
nostril.
the frontal lobe was severed from the rest of the brain. Oh, and instead of anesthesia, Freeman would electrocute people until they passed out.
The operation can be done under any general anesthetic, but electroshock is preferred because of its familiarity to the head. Transorbital lobotomy is performed during the stage of post-convulsive coma. The convulsion lasts
like she in
about 40
pain.
seconds. When the patient shows signs of returning consciousness, a
Overly
second
getting
convulsion
shocked,
is
and then she's
administered.
gonna get ice
Usually
pick up the
3
nose.
successive convulsions are necessary, but in old people a single one may be sufficient, while in a sturdy young person 4 or even 6 convulsions may be administered without danger.
Bro, what the hell was this guy's problem? The new transorbital technique only required one person, and it can be done in as little as 10 minutes. Once again, though, this procedure was only supposed to be done as a last resort if nothing else worked. But Freeman got careless. He started traveling around the country in a van, performing transorbital lobotomies for a crowd. He went on to personally perform over 2,500 ice pick lobotomies over the next few years.
2,500. They let this happen 2,500 times.
Times more than the regular prefrontal version that he had done with Watts. Now, a lot of medical professionals were not fans of this new technique, including James Watts. He was disgusted by Walt's laissez-faire approach and insisted that this was a serious procedure that should only be done by a trained team of neurosurgeons. But Freeman basically told him, ice pick go brrr, so Watts decided to cut all ties with his old partner. This was the beginning of the end. If it wasn't obvious before, it certainly was now that Freeman grossly exaggerated the positive impact of lobotomies. Other doctors started following up with his patients and realized that only about a third of them had experienced any improvement.
He definitely lied about the averages so he can get that Nobel Prize.
There was a growing consensus that the risk
That's all he
was
cared
not
about,
worth
was
the
the fame and
reward.
fortune.
But the final nail in the coffin came with the advent of antipsychotic drugs in the late 50s, early 60s. So people with bipolar and schizophrenia could now take a pill instead of having their brains thrown in a blender and seeing what happens. To bring things full circle, John Fulton, the guy who did the chimp experiments that kicked off lobotomania, announced that lobotomies were over. But none of that was going to stop Walter Freeman. He insisted on the efficacy of lobotomies and continued his crusade. Freeman moved to California and continued to do lobotomies as if nothing had changed. Until 1967. Freeman performed his last lobotomy on a woman named Helen Mortensen, who had previously received a transorbital lobotomy from Freeman himself 10 years prior.
So
I guess she was due for a touch-up.
and got
Unfortunately,
another lobotomy
this
10
time the
years
surgery
after.
didn't go well, and Helen passed away. After this, Walter was banned from ever
Yeah, of course she passed away. She already got pieces of her brain missing. She came back to get more pieces of her brain missing.
surgery. At the end of the day, Walter kind of got what he wanted. His name is definitely in the history books, just not in the way he was expecting.
That was a good video. I learned a lot about the history of lobotomy.